Well, thank you all for coming to celebrate my birthday. It was very touching to hear that people talked about me this morning. And I have to say it was also embarrassing. And the reason it was embarrassing is that honestly, I understand the need to focus on people. If you see a person who's done a painting and you like it, you think of the painter. It's better to think of the painting. The important thing is what's done and not the person who does it, not the instrument for what happens, but what happens. And the reason it's important is much more personal than you might think. It touches each one of you. Because if we think what Master brought to us, we also can think very easily and naturally, and in fact, quite properly, what a great soul he was. But he didn't come to tell us what a great soul he was. Jesus didn't come to tell us what a great master he was. They came to show us what we can do, what we can accomplish. That's the whole thing. And Ananda is much more than somebody who started something or a group of people who started something. I remember years ago somebody came to me and said, "You have some wonderful people here." I said, "You know, if you met one or two people like that, you could say, okay, they're wonderful people. When you see a whole group of people like that, you have to say it's what they're doing that makes it that way." And we have to realize that whatever's happening, we can make it happen. Whatever has happened, we can make more. And that was what was so beautiful, seeing that concert last night and seeing how many people that David Eby was able to bring together and in a spirit of just humility and service and complete dedication to music, in which he's a real musician himself, to bring the best out of people. And if they aren't perfect, it doesn't matter. Help them to become that way by expecting the best. But it's made me think, what is this path that Master's brought us? What has he brought that really is unique? He often said, "I killed Yogananda long ago. No one lives in this temple now but God." And in fact, every time I'd look at him, I would feel that I was really in the presence of God. It was not a personality. You look at people, usually there's an ego looking back at you. Maybe likes, dislikes, personality of one kind or another. I remember him saying to me one time, whenever when I have to take on a new body and I see the kind of personality I'm supposed to have, it's a little uncomfortable at first, like a hot overcoat, like a heavy overcoat on a hot day. And then I get used to it. Well, that's how he was with his personality, because he had to have a personality to live in this world. But on the other hand, there was nobody there. It was really God playing that role, and for a purpose. I've often thought, I've noticed some people say, for example, that he was so convivial and friendly and outward, and not the real yogi who's very stern and inward and rejects everything. Master embraced everything. And I've thought that it's sort of probably because he's been coming back so many times. When he says that as long as one stray brother is left by the wayside, I will keep returning, plying my boat back to these shores to bring him back to the consciousness of my Father. This is a fantastic promise. And we think, well, what a beautiful resolution. I don't think that that's the beginning of the story at all. I think he's been doing it already for eons. If you look at these great masters of our path, you see that they're an extraordinary group. Krishna, Babaji was Krishna. That's what he said. Lahiri Mahasaya and Master told us. Lahiri Mahasaya was Janaka, King Janaka, thousands of years ago, the father of Sita who married Rama. They themselves, Krishna spoke about being in another incarnation thousands of years before. These people have been coming Whether they're really the gurus of this planet, they're certainly very central in that divine drama of bringing souls to God, coming back again and again with different purposes according to the age in which they come. And each time they're different. Yes, look at Krishna, he's very different from Babaji. Not really, because inside he was completely untouched by it all. And Master was completely untouched. He had to go through the whole show, the spectacle, but it wasn't he. And so God came to bring certain principles. Yes, he came to bring Kriya Yoga. Yes, he came to bring meditation. There's more to it than that. He came also to bring certain, excuse me, certain attitudes that mark the change of consciousness from an age, Kali Yuga, in which people were attached to matter, in which they thought that everything that they could gain would be through material means, money and possessions and power, and all things outward. And nowadays, people have come to the point where they must understand. You know, Sri Yukteswar said that this world is energy, matter is energy, 11 years before science actually found that that was the case. He said that this planet is moving toward the center of the galaxy before people even knew that there was a center of the galaxy. Just a few years earlier, they'd been thinking that the sun was the center of everything. But he pointed out that we're moving toward the center. Then when they discovered where the center is, they found that it's somewhere in Sagittarius, and that we are in fact moving in this galaxy, and that our motion is in a general direction, you might say, as an ellipse toward that center of the galaxy. He said certain things that nobody at that time could have known, although one wonders sometimes when you read. For example, you know, Jonathan Swift, wasn't it he who wrote Gulliver's Travels? He described 100 years before they were discovered the satellites of Mars. He gave them names, and he said the speed that they were moving, the direction they were moving, incredible. 100 years later, they discovered it. So was it from some ancient document? If so, nobody's ever found it. Was he a wise person? Well, maybe. But there is this capacity in man to go way ahead of science in its understanding and discoveries. Jules Verne made all kinds of fantastic science fiction fantasies, and yet every one of them has been fulfilled. We've traveled to the moon. Yeah, we haven't had men from Mars come yet, but it's coming. Everything's coming bit by bit. And what we're seeing is that the discoveries on an intuitional level do often have an extraordinary validity. Well, Sri Yukteswar, who was a master, we needn't gasp in awe that he could see these things, but he said, and it's come to pass since then, because when matter was discovered to be energy, was nearly 100 years ago, 1905, and now it's 2002. Just 97 years. And in that length of time, we've had a complete revolution in the way we look at things. But what it's done is completely confuse everybody, because we've gotten away from old definitions of values, the old orthodox theology, the old orthodox dogmas, the old view that things are set and firm and that morals are absolutely this way and can't be anything else. And suddenly you find that people in other countries live differently, think differently. The gypsies in Tuscany even, who don't have very much to do with Western civilization, their mores are that if you can't lie cleverly, there's no truth in you. Now you figure that one out. But as we've traveled over the world, we see so many different moral principles, ways of explaining things, ways of understanding and behaving. I think I told you a couple of weeks ago, an extraordinary photograph, horrible photograph of a group of cannibals rejoicing around a cadaver just before eating it. And you could see that they were enjoying it according to their definition. You could also see that that kind of enjoyment was sick. It was horrible. It was repulsive. Now, you can't come in and say, well, morals are just a matter of taste. You think this, we think that, it just doesn't matter. It's much more than that. There are certain rules which we have to discover in the way we're made, in the way our bodies are made, in the way our consciousness is made. For example, I can say, and I suppose some people may have said, I doubt they've gone to this extreme, but I can say, okay, it's my taste and my choice to eat nails. Well, maybe a master could, but I couldn't. It would kill me. And so you can't say that that little decision has any validity. There are a lot of other things like that. In the field of eating, we understand very quickly that people who eat too much white flour, white flour was considered the bread of the nobility, the aristocracy, which is why they were so sick and the peasants were pretty well. You can't make up your own mind on these things, nor can you make up your mind on such things as it's more blessed to give than to receive. Why not? Because there's something in us, not that wants to give, but that wants to expand. We want to expand our knowledge. We want to expand our sympathy. We want to expand our understanding of things. And the more we take, the more, excuse me, the more we take from others, the more grasping we are. You look at people, I tell you, Ananda is a wonderful place for this reason, among others. It's a great laboratory. You see that people live in different ways, knowing the teachings nonetheless, according to their own nature, they'll live them according to the way they are. Some people think, what's in it for me? Some people think, how can I help? Some people think, well, I need to get for myself first, then we can grow. I know in the early years of Ananda, people came to me and said, well, why don't we close the retreat? We've got to get our own act together before we think of serving other people. I said, serving other people is a part of getting our own act together. If we were to close the retreat, we'd never open it again. It would not be the way to go. And so what we find is that when we think first for ourselves, this is a nice principle, but when you see hundreds of people living these things, and some living them well and some living them not so well and some living them badly, and you see that the results are always the same. That always those who think more in terms of, well, what can I do? What's good for everybody, not just what's good for me? How can I serve God and truth better? They always flourish. And those who think, well, but what about me? What's in it for me? I got to get my trip together first. I want to process my own problems and so on. They never get it together. It doesn't work. And so we see that there must be a principle involved. It's not just a nice, pleasant thought. It's not just a moral maxim. There are certain principles in human nature. You can walk down the street of any city and you can see that some faces are happy. And you can see it always in those eyes. There's a consciousness of welcoming other people, sharing with other people, including other people in their reality. And you can see other people who go around with this hostile expression. And you know that it's always that they see the others as the enemy. They've built a little fence around themselves and they just want to sit here in us for and no more attitude. And you see that quite apart from taste, quite apart from any opinion in the matter, one works, the other doesn't. Now, why does it work? Some people may say, well, but I like to be alone. I like to be grumpy. I like to be cut off by... That isn't true. And this is something wonderful in Master's book, The Science of Religion, that everybody basically wants only one thing, to avoid pain and to find happiness. It's quite that simple. Even animals want to avoid pain and find happiness. Whatever they define as happiness, whatever they define it, that's their happiness. Our definition of happiness is another thing. But the fact is that we all want to be happy. Some think they're going to find it in one way, some in another, and they make mistakes. They make lots of mistakes. Some people think, well, I'm going to find happiness through alcohol. And they have good times laughing and joking and getting drunk. But after a while, it doesn't work so well. The body starts to fall apart, their marriage starts to fall apart, their friendships fall apart, they lose their jobs, and alcoholics suffer greatly until they finally pick it all up, get themselves together and say, I'm not going to do it anymore. But that takes a lot of time. You know, when people say, I don't believe in reincarnation, just think of this. How long it takes to overcome that one little mistake of judgment. You think, well, I'm going to get drunk, I'm going to love it, I like being convivial. You do it for a few years, you're caught. How long it takes to get out of that one habit. Think of drug addiction, but how many other kinds of addiction there are, and how many different definitions of those addictions. Some people think, well, I want a beautiful home by the ocean. Well, that doesn't work. The ocean comes and destroys the home. Okay, well, what I really want is a house in the mountains. Some people say, I want money, and then they say, well, okay, the stock market crashed. Maybe I should have invested it differently next time. But we go on and on and on from one life after another. It's amazing how long it takes for people to learn, often, not everybody, but to learn just one lesson. It's almost pathetic. And the truth is that there are laws behind it all. The more you seek your happiness in something intangible in yourself, the more you find you're happy all the time. There was this man in Vermont where people at least have the reputation for liking to be grumpy. And this man was grumpy. In fact, he was the town grump. Grouch, of course, is the word. I like to play with words. And he would snarl at children for running over his flower bed, and he would snarl at the dogs for running over his lawn, and he'd snarl at the neighbors for making too much noise, and he'd snarl at this and snarl at that, and he just went through life miserable. Everybody shunned him. One day, to everybody's absolute bewilderment, he came out of his house bounding and happy and smiling and greeted everybody, greeted the children, patted the dogs, if they let him near this, I don't know, and was great. And people they gossiped about this for a while, as people will, and finally they appointed a committee. And the committee came to this man, he said, listen, we're used to you being the town grouch. What's with you? What are you doing? Why are you so happy all the time? We just want to know what's wrong. And he said, you know, for years I was waiting for something to make me happy, and I finally realized it wasn't going to happen. I decided I was just going to be happy. And from then on, he was happy. Happiness doesn't depend on things. Happiness depends on attitudes. And if you can be happy, okay, I'll tell you a story. Years ago, I came over the Atlantic many times because my dad lived in Romania, but being American, he had a vacation every 3 years, all expenses paid, to come to America first class. So we came over like royalty on the big liners. So this last trip was the 10th. Well, I always loved sailing. I loved the sea. But the first 2 days were absolute misery. I'd get so sick. And I remember looking at the prow of the ship going up, and I'd try to pull it down. And then it would go down. I'd try to pull it up. And you know, I don't know if you ever saw, I'm sure many of you have, The Mouse That Roared, where Peter Sellers gets on this ship. He's worried about his weakness for seasickness. First thing he does is, the ship is still in harbor, mind you, goes up the gangplank, crosses the deck, and leans over the side. Well, that's about the way I felt. And so many years later, I was on Green Island off the coast, on the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. And I had to lecture in Cairns, which is in Queensland, which is 16 miles away from Green Island. But it was so beautiful and so tranquil there. And although they did have a crocodile that was guilty of eating 15 people, it was well penned up, so I could go and stare at it in the eye like this. But anyway, Um, it was beautiful, but the next day, unfortunately, I had to go back because I had to begin my lectures, and it was so stormy, heavy winds and whipping the sea up, and I thought, oh God, I can just see myself arriving at the lecture hall on crutches and sort of leaning against a wall while I tried to deliver this peroration of some sort. And I said, no, I'm not going to accept it. I'm just going to enjoy this trip. And I told myself this with very firm affirmation. And every time the boat went through one of these corkscrew motions, and I would just say every time, yes, good, wonderful. And really it worked. I have to admit, I arrived at the dock at the other end pretty weak in willpower, but I still felt fine, and the lecture went well. And you know, ever since then, I've never had seasickness. Coming back this time on the Queen Elizabeth II, I had no seasickness. A lot of people were out for the duration or out of the dining room for a while. I didn't have any trouble that way, and the Queen Elizabeth is nothing like the ships we used to sail earlier. It's pretty big. But the thing is that if you affirm, if you go with things, if you go with life, instead of thinking, well, I don't like this, and I don't like that, and I wish it were different, I wish he wouldn't talk like that. As long as you have this attitude of rejection and sort of trying to pull this one up and push that one down and so on, you'll be amazed at how easily you can go through life and just accept what comes. Well, this is an attitude that has been talked about, yes, in religion, has been talked about in spiritual teachings for centuries. Nothing new in any truth. But what you find is that the emphasis has been, by and large, on suffering. By and large, the more you suffer, the more saintly you are, and the more God will be pleased with you. God knows why they think God is such a sadist. But there was one monk who told me about some very saintly brother who died in his monastery. And they would ask him, how are you today? He said, oh, thanks be to God, terrible. Every day, oh, the pain is awful, thank God. Well, okay, that's good. But I don't think he had it quite in this attitude. It was rather that, oh, I'm going to find heaven because I'm suffering so much. Not that I refuse to suffer and I am in heaven right now. And in this respect, what Master has brought is a whole new attitude. He said it in that book, The Science of Religion. What do you think of when you think of God? Usually people think of God as infinite, omnipresent, omniscient. Concepts, definitions that don't mean that much to us. We may think vaguely of aspiring to infinity, but I don't think it strikes anybody very, very close. It's hard to understand. Omniscient, well, I mean, it's pretty much to know just a little bit. Some Swami I met in India had a library of 150,000 books, something like that, and he could tell you any page of any book, just where to look on that page for what he was telling you to find. He knew his whole thing perfectly. That's extraordinary intelligence, but it's certainly not omniscience. That's just a tiny little branch of knowledge. And you read stories of amazing geniuses who could do all these great things that Leonardo da Vinci could write forwards and backwards simultaneously. Mozart, at the age of 5, composed his first symphony. These are, sure, they're amazing, but they're not omniscience. If you think of omniscience, you're not really inspired by it. You almost perhaps have a kind of fear of God prying into your own private thoughts. He can't pry because he's there already. He's having them through you. No question of prying. He knows you. Backwards and forwards, far better than you know yourself. There was this one time, 2 of the monks, Norman and Boone at Mount Washington, and they decided to go to Encinitas to see Master. And they took a bus down there, and on the bus they talked, as some young men will, about things they should not of. Master greeted them at the gate, and he quoted word for word what they'd been saying. This kind of thing, you can count on it. God does know you. You can sort of huddle back and say, oh, I hope he didn't notice that one, God. He did. He does. He will. Nonetheless, it doesn't inspire you to reach for him. And the definitions of God that have been given to us in tradition, East and West, don't inspire us in the same way to seek him as what Master proposed, bliss. He said bliss is what we're all seeking. Bliss is what we all want. We want to avoid pain and find happiness. And we find happiness in false ways. We find it in drunkenness and we become unhappy. We find it in that rose trellis cottage by the sea, and finally we become so bored we just plead with somebody to hit us on the head to see if we're still alive. And so everything that you find, you think some people are lucky because they have this and others are lucky because they have. Nobody's lucky if they have anything. They're lucky if they've found the secret to it all, which is forgetting about things, finding happiness in yourself. You are the source of all that you want. And you may look at yourself in the mirror and say, huh, me? That's not what the you I'm talking about. I'm talking about that germ inside you of consciousness that always wants fulfillment, never will be satisfied until it finds that kind of fulfillment that it's not tangible. You can't identify it with anything. It's something intangible, abstract, infinite. This bliss is what we're all seeking for the simple reason that that's where we've all come. It's an age-old memory. We know that that's our true nature. That's why even the worst criminal, you'll never hear him say, I'm evil. Dillinger was public enemy number 1 many years ago, and he died in a shootout with the police. And they found by his body a little letter he'd written saying, I've been much misunderstood. Within this heart, really, there beats a very loving heart. Well, he'd killed a few people. That's not everybody's definition of a loving heart. But the fact that he believed it is all important. Because each one of us has that belief in his own basic goodness. We all believe that there's something in us that perhaps hasn't been misunderstood, perhaps we haven't understood, but it's there. We want it. We want joy. We want happiness. And it isn't really that we want others to suffer, except to the extent that we believe, we convince ourselves in delusion that as they go down, we go up. But it's not a seesaw. And so that's a delusion. People going down doesn't lift you. Well, we learn that lesson too, how many lessons we have to learn. You have to go through it all. God's sakes, all the pirates and the bandits and the millionaires and the generals and everything that you can imagine. You've done it all. And the beautiful and most fascinating thing is you've done every one of those things in your way. Everybody is unique. Master wrote in the Autobiography of a Yogi that every atom is dowered with individuality. God has a particular song, you might say, to sing through each one of us. Now in this age, there is a new wave of consciousness, and Master is representing the divine will for that wave. Master is bringing it to a focus, and in his life, it's not that he'll be that way in every life. He has to be in each life according to God's need at that time. He doesn't come with any personal desire, any personal attachment, or even personality. It's just an act that he has to put on. To give you an idea of the act, one time out at 29 Palms, he called Anandamoy in and with great fear said, there's a spider there. You imagine Master being afraid of a spider. Of course he wasn't. Anandamoy himself knew that this was just an act, but Master carried it through. Anandamoy started to sweep it up. Master, oh, get careful, it's close, coming closer. I was amazed at how Master could put on attitudes that were absolutely ridiculous just to test your reaction, just to bring out, and Anandamoy knew in this case that it was an act, but he wanted to bring out in Anandamoy that reaction, that yes, this is a test, don't think about it as important. I saw a master act in so many different ways. Like one time, this wasn't the one I saw, but another disciple, Gene Halp, told me he was up in the third floor interview room and Master was scolding one of the nuns. And you'd have thought he was furious with her. He was raging up and down like this, shouting at her. Every time he turned his back to her and looked at Gene, he'd smile and wink and turn back like this. He wasn't touched by any of those feelings. All he was just a pure ray, and this is what I saw behind everything. I saw that he could act in just little ways to get some thought out of you. Amazing how these things could just sort of flit across his consciousness like clouds in the sky. And yet, he would not be touched by any of it. Some woman whom Master had shown a certain amount of favor to her husband, and so she came to the car with a certain amount of presumption, as if, well, we're favorites. And just the way he looked, she didn't catch it, I'm sure. I could see it. Not disapproval, he never disapproved, but just something sort of, when will you understand kind of attitude. Very calmly looking at her. It's an amazing experience to live with a man of God, because you see God coming through that in so many different ways, like a flawless mirror, bringing to one's attention things that he needed to learn to understand. But in all of that, what Master brought was certain emphases. Mind you, the truth never changes, but certain emphases that are needed at this particular time. Now, what is needed at this time? I think one thing that's needed is and this is one reason he came to America. America, although adolescent and somewhat ignorant, less and less so as it grows up, but nonetheless, America is new territory. It's a place where new ideas are possible, where it's possible to bring out new ways of doing things. And this is a glorious thing. Old ways have shown their beauty, but they can't come up as easily with new things because their road is blocked by all their old habits. I love living in Italy, and I find that there's a great deal of openness there too, and heart quality, which I love. But on the other hand, the very stones are old there. Here it isn't that way. There is a certain naivete, but there's also an openness to how can we do things better? How can we improve on things? There's a story of a group of students who were asked to write essays on the elephant. And the German wrote about the uses of elephant in time of war. And the Italian wrote about the musical trumpeting of the elephant. And the Englishman wrote about the aristocratic character of the elephant. And the Frenchman wrote about lovemaking among the elephants. And the American wrote about how to make bigger and better elephants. This is the way of the American mentality. How can we improve on it? Well, Master loved that. In fact, he came up with a few inventions on it of his own. He told me about some of them. It was something he approved of. Well, this meant that this was part of the consciousness he was bringing. Not bringing as an individual. Edison lived before him. Lots of others lived before him. Affirming. Encouraging. He was not saying that religion should cling to tradition. Religion should do things in the old ways. Give me that old-time religion. If it's good enough for Father, it's good enough for me. No. He was out for doing things in ways that worked. Like he attended a lecture, I think it was by Amy Semple McPherson. There were about 5,000 people there, and she got up and said, "You're all sinners, get down on your knees." Master said later, I was the only one who wasn't on his knees because I wouldn't admit I'm a sinner. Why should we admit that we're sinners? He said, to call yourself a sinner is the worst sin. Always look at life fresh. Look at life for its opportunities to give you something better, to give you something fresh that will help you to advance. Don't go around with a heavy burden of guilt. So you did it, forget it. Try better next time. It's the only way to be free. I remember back when I was 20, I guess? 21. No, 20. Doesn't matter at all. Why should I waste your time? I'd been smoking regularly, and I decided I wanted to give it up, and it wasn't easy. And this is something I guess I was born in tune with this ray of Master's consciousness maybe, because I tried, but you know, that cigarette tasted so good with the coffee after lunch or something, and so I kept going back to it, like Mark Twain, who said that smoking's the easiest habit in the world to give up. I've done it 1,000 times. Well, that's about how it was. Now, here's the interesting thing. Every time I went back to smoking, I never said I failed. I always said I haven't yet succeeded. And so, with that constant affirmation of potential success, bit by bit, my mind developed to the point where after a year, I remember I said to one of my roommates, well, from now on, I'm giving up smoking. Yeah, we've heard that one before. And I said, no, I mean it. And the next day, I still had a half-empty packet of cigarettes in my pocket, and I carried it with me and gave it out to my friends. I hadn't the slightest desire for another cigarette. Never have had. Well, why? Because I kept affirming, don't worry about your mistakes. Keep affirming that every time you fail, look on it as an opportunity to affirm. Master said, the season of failure is the best time for sowing the seeds of success. Now, these are new thoughts, really. Yes, you encounter them in other writings, but Master brought it all to a focus with such power that it becomes a new wave of consciousness that he helped to bring into the world. Not uniquely, but the power behind it. And mind you, power is a part of living rightly. You can't find God if you're a wimp. Yeah, I like to meditate. No, be strong. Boy, you should have been with Master, I tell you. Could have been scary. People say, oh, how wonderful it was to live with Master. Oh, yes, it was. But I noticed that not many people did. For them, it was sort of like a hotel where you sort of hang your coat up for a few days and leave. Many people couldn't take it. But if you tuned in, it was wonderful. But wonderful with great energy, great power, and great dedication. So that's a part of his ray. Joy is a part of his ray. And again and again, what I found is that it's not his personality. It's something that came through his personality. Anyway, I wrote all those chords and everything in one day. I don't have the foggiest idea what a single one of those chords is. I couldn't name it. I flunked music composition because I never came to class. No, I'm a klutz. I really don't know these things. But I do know what I know. And if Mozart were to come and say, well, I think you should have done it this way, I would have said, no, this is what I want. This is what's right for this particular mood. And it is so that when you get the consciousness, the details, the rules, the methodology, the technique is really secondary. It does help to know it. Boy, it was really difficult for me when I began writing music back in 1964. And yes, I knew how to write music because I used to play the piano and practice for hours a day and so on. But it was difficult learning rules that I didn't know existed. But the rules are there. They're there to be learned. Once you've learned them, you know them better than if you'd gone to school to learn them and just learned them by rote. And so, in fact, it was a blessing not to know these things. But the point I want to make is that the inspiration is what formed the music, not the music that formed the inspiration. And many of our philosophy, our teachings, are a part of this music. Like in the quartet that you heard last night, I wanted to write something that that expressed the spirit of a cooperative community. I know that my mother's violin teacher said when she heard it, she said, "But that's wrong. The first violin should have the melody." Well, no, it wasn't wrong, because I wanted to give everybody a chance. So I'd give the cello a chance, and the viola a chance, and the second violin a chance, and each one got to play a melody. This is what communities are all about. You see, everything that you do in life is a philosophy. And as we tune into the teaching that Master brought us, we begin to find that that philosophy can take shape, that the consciousness behind what we do is the real essence of it. You know, thousands of people go to art school, music school, this school, that school to learn skill. Almost nobody comes out and becomes even successful, and certainly very few geniuses. Genius comes from you, it doesn't come from a teacher. The other interesting thing is that many geniuses have never gone to school. They've had to learn these things on their own. But you do learn these things on their own because they're there to be discovered. And if you really apply yourself with willpower, it does take willpower. I'd get a melody, it would have a certain mood to it, and then I'd have to find the right chords. And to hang on to that inspiration while I went through all these bad chords till I found the right one, that took willpower, that's all. Only willpower, not genius, willpower. You've got to have stick-to-itiveness. But I found that in the process that I understood those chords a lot better. I understood why they say this, why this chord says what you want to say and why another one doesn't. Many times when David Miller plays a perfectly legitimate chord in something he's arranged for, I say, "No, that's the wrong chord." And I try to explain it. I said, "I really don't know. Come with me, I'll come to the keyboard and I'll find it for you." Once I find he says, "Oh yeah, that's G7 some minor." So he understands, so that's fine by me. But I hear it in my mind, I know. Well look, what I do is so trivial compared to what's there to be done, don't you see? What I've done is, it'll die when I die. And everybody will go around saying, "Oh, look at this wonderful composer who did all these different things." Big deal. You know what that is really? It's a wonderful excuse for not doing it. I want you all to feel that you have if one human being can do something, you can do it. I've always had the thought that I can do anything if God gives me the power to do it, and I can't do anything if He doesn't. He's the one who gives it. And the more we can tune in, and that's what these communities are about. Master, when he put me in charge of the monks at Mount Washington, he didn't sit me down and say, "Now, Walter, this is how you want to do it. Do this, don't do that." Nothing. But I found that by tuning into him, suddenly I understood. And crises would arise, and this has happened at Ananda. I don't know how I understand, but I understand what we have to do. He gives it to you. This is why I've always remembered Rajarshi's words to me. He said, "Master has a great work to do through you, Walter, and he will give you the strength to do it." And it has proved true. But it isn't mine. It's when I remember sometimes somebody will ask me something, advice or something, and I search my memory for experiences I've had that would help me to understand, and I have to say, "I'm sorry, I don't know." In the very moment that I say I don't know, I do know. Why? Because I've given up trying to stretch for it and turned it over to God, and then God gives me the answer. Try that. Don't think I've got to find the answer. Say, "Well, God, what do you want me to do?" You'll be amazed at how that truth comes. God wants to use Ananda in a very particular way. This is an age when living together is something that can bring new power, new understanding, new ways of looking at things that haven't been around before. The consciousness behind Ananda is what makes Ananda. Every book I've ever read on utopia and perfect communities and so on, they all talk about the system. No system will make a community. It's people that make communities. And it isn't people who make communities, it's people in tune with a state of consciousness. This state of consciousness God wants to give to us. is giving to us. How wonderful it was last night to hear all those different singers, the choir, the musicians, even the children, playing so beautifully. Why? Because basically we as a community don't emphasize personal glory. That's very important. David Eby, as the director, also doesn't have that desire to emphasize personal glory. I'll tell you one thing, and you want to close your ears, David? Life is the quest for joy. The cello solo in that, to my ear, is one of the most beautiful cello solos I've heard. He who plays the cello exquisitely chose not to use that. He had the violin, because we had a violinist here, Nancy, who plays beautifully. And so to give her the chance to shine, he put her in that solo role. Well, that was the kind of spirit that made that evening. The more we don't push ourselves, the more we try to push principle, the more we try to push the ideals we're living for, the more we'll find that Ananda becomes successful. But if we begin to think, oh, well, we're pretty good, that will be the moment that you've peaked. From then on, it'll be downhill. Forget yourself. Forget your skills, your talents, and all of that. Give it to God. He has so much He could do through you. But don't ever think, well, who am I? I can't. Always have that attitude that there's nothing I can't do. If God does it, I can't do it, but He can do it. You'll be amazed. And the thing is that He'll do it in a particular way, because you're here in a particular, don't think you're just in a place. You're here under the umbrella of the consciousness of great masters. They are here. Their presence is alive. And in this umbrella of their consciousness, we all thrive. If we get out of tune with that, we can do other things fine. But in this, we have a chance to do something that is extraordinary. You know, it's like a cello. If you took a string and strung it between 2 points and tried to play it, it would sound pretty tinny, or whatever the word is. You wouldn't hear it from here to there. Put a cello behind it, a sounding board, and you have a rich tone that fills a whole concert hall. Well, everything that we do, if we understand that we alone are just nothing, but when we're a part of something greater, and when we understand that these people are not the greater thing, but that consciousness is something, and it isn't you as individuals who are doing it, it's rather that in bringing that consciousness out by tuning yourselves to it, you give it more resonance, you give it more power, and the more there are of us, the more that consciousness begins to swell like a wave, and it can very much influence an entire culture, an entire world. If you look at the movements that have taken place in history, think of the Renaissance. It had a tremendous impact, decisive impact on the entire Western world, plus echoes throughout the world. You go to Florence and you see what existed of Florence in those days, practically a village by our standards. Assisi, the walls of Assisi are tiny, yet look at the movement of St. Francis that came out of there. It didn't take very many people. It took those few people working together, not just each one strutting off on his own saying, well, I want to do it my own way. We don't want to do it our way. What is our way? It doesn't exist. Somebody said to me once who wanted to write music, he said, well, you know, you write music. You feel compelled to. You've just got to write music. I said, listen, I could never write another note in my life. It wouldn't matter to me. I'm not doing it because I have to. I'm doing it because it's an offering to God. Be free in what you do. Don't think that it defines you, and don't define yourself by anything. Just say that we're all doing God's will. The less ego there is in what we do, the more we can accomplish. The more ego, there's a beautiful saying in India, the road of life is very narrow. Only you or God can walk down it, but you can't walk it together. There's the thought, yeah, but what about me? The more you can get rid of that thought, the freer you are. The more you can get rid of that thought, the more you find your sympathies, your understanding, your love, everything expands. You begin to feel cramped, imprisoned in this little ego. Don't give it that power that the ego demands to itself. Just say, well, I'm nothing, you're everything. And you find so much freedom in that thought. It's exhilarating. Just think, just this little example. You look at a sunset. I told you this example a couple of weeks ago. You see the beautiful clouds. You sort of almost feel the symphony of life. And suddenly you think, well, gee, I think I could paint that just as well. Suddenly you've forgotten the sunset, you've forgotten the symphony, you've forgotten the beauty and power and glory of it all, and you're just thinking, me. What a silly little thing to think about. If you could forget that, how wonderful it is to enjoy something without the thought of you. This we need, and that's again what a community does. Not one of us is important, but what we're doing is important, and that's the point I want to get across. It's important because it can help thousands of other people. Not you, not me, but God through this form, because God has something He wants to say to the world at this time. And this is one way, and a very important way, that Master has chosen. That's why He departed from His chosen subject time after time, lecture after lecture, to talk about communities. He had another topic assigned to Him. He still talked about communities. He wanted people to learn this. It's only if groups of people can live together. And those who can't, because not everybody can. For instance, you've got a wife or a husband who's not in tune. You can't say, well, goodbye. You have to be true to your commitments, to your way of life. I don't mean leave everything necessarily. But if you aren't, then be in tune spiritually. Come here when you can. Be a part of it. After all, our community is not just Ananda. Our community is everybody. When we had that fire here and we found that there was a county vehicle responsible for it, our feeling was that the whole county is our community. Why should we take our bad luck out on the county? They're our community too. The world is your community. But even more, those are your community who share your ideals. Those are your real neighbors. How wonderful it would be if you go to the gas station, there's a Kriya Bond putting gas in your tank, wouldn't it? We need to realize that this community is much larger than just a little piece of land. It isn't just what we're doing. One time in India, somebody in a large lecture asked me a question for his own spiritual life. And I said to him, well, why don't you go, there's an Aurobindo ashram near here, a center. I think it would be good if you would go to that periodically and get recharged. He came to me later and he said, well, how did you know I'm a member of the Aurobindo group? I said, I don't know, I just felt it. But you know that in SRF they would have condemned me as disloyal. I'm not trying to convert people to this. Master wasn't trying to do that. I'm trying to convert them to their own selves. That's what it's all about. What does it mean if we have more members? What it does mean is if that gas station attendant who doesn't live here, who doesn't know Ananda but practices Kriya, how wonderful. And if he doesn't practice Kriya, if he sings Ramanama, if he thinks of God, how wonderful. We need to break the barriers of our thoughts and realize that community means loving God together. But you need a focus, and Ananda is a focus, a very strong focus. And the more people can join this community, either living here or being in tune with it, wherever you live, the more we can make an impact in this world out of all proportion to the numbers involved. Most people just are on a treadmill, or they're just treading water. A few people who really decide they want to swim, they're the ones who make the waves. The few people that decide, the Renaissance, it wasn't as if everybody in Florence was all behind it. It was a handful of people, very few. Others sort of rubbed off on a little. You read about the American Revolution. There's a book about John Adams, fascinating book. What's it called? I mean, who was the author?
Sherrar?
Huh? No, the other one.
David McCullough.
Huh? I hope you heard. I didn't hear. The point is that there were not very many people behind the revolution, and many of those who were villainous, selfish, egotistical, wanting to grab what they could. You have to expect that where the human scene is. But the point is, and what really changed people was just a very few people. Yet those few people spoke out. They had the strength. When a few people speak, when a few people live, when a few people try to do what I've tried in my little small life to do, not for me, as an example to others, that the more we can do together to bring this ray of God's joy, God's love into the world, you can do it in so many ways. You don't have to write music. You don't have to take photographs. You don't have to write books. You don't have to start communities. Just be loving. Just remember the simple little thought. Anytime you have a decision to make, what would Master do? Very simple question to ask, but boy, does it open up horizons. What would Master do? Well, he wouldn't like you to be selfish. He wouldn't like you to be mean. He wouldn't like you to think only for yourself. And the more and more you think the way he lived, the more you find yourself expressing who he was, and that's what he wants. He wants thousands of arms, feet, to carry his teaching, this message, this vibration out into the world to everybody. You can, every one of you, be that. You can be instruments of the Masters. It's your choice. But mind you, let me just tell you what that choice means. That if you choose that, you get drawn into God. And if you reject it, maybe you'll find some other way, but you've lost an awfully good opportunity. So I don't say everybody should come this way, but for God's sakes, if you feel in tune with it, then don't be a coward. Dive in. Forget if the water's cold or whatever. It doesn't matter. Dive in. You'll see that you'll be protected. Everything will go well for you. And I can say that with some experience.